Welcome to Sleep History, where legends meet reality in the most soothing way possible. Tonight's journey takes you deep into the brutal world of 5th and 6th century Britain, where the real Arthur may have lived and fought. Forget the shining armour and noble quests. This is the story of desperate survival in post-Roman collapse, where civilization hung by a thread and warriors fought with mud on their boots and death in their hearts. As you settle into comfort tonight, let our gentle fireplace sounds and calm narration transport you to a Britain of crumbling walls, abandoned cities, and Saxon raiders. Through 6 compelling chapters, we'll explore the harsh realities that shaped the greatest legend in British history. From the collapse of Roman order to the rise of Dark Age warlords, discover why survival in Arthur's world required more than courage. It demanded cunning, brutality, and an iron will to endure. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and prepare for a journey into the Dark Ages, where every dawn was uncertain and every victory came at a terrible price. Sweet dreams await in the shadow of history's greatest mystery. Tonight, as you settle into comfort, imagine waking up in the year 500 CE in what we now call Britain. There's no Camelot with shining towers, no noble knights in gleaming armour, no magical swords or wise wizards. Instead, you'd find yourself in a land torn apart by war, where Roman civilization is crumbling. Saxon raiders burn villages nightly, and survival means choosing between starving in ruins or fighting with whatever weapon you can find. This was the real world of Arthur. Not a fairy tale kingdom, but a desperate struggle for survival in the Dark Ages. So settle by our fire tonight, and let's discover the brutal truth behind the legend. The year 410 CE marked the end of an era that had lasted for nearly 4 centuries. When Emperor Honorius sent his fateful letter to the cities of Britain, telling them to look to your own defences, he was not merely withdrawing military support. He was abandoning an entire civilization to fend for itself in an increasingly dangerous world. The Romano-British population, who had grown accustomed to the protection of the legions and the stability of imperial administration, suddenly found themselves isolated on the edge of the known world. For generations, Britain had been one of Rome's most prosperous provinces. Cities like Londinium, Eboracum, and Camulodunum bustled with trade and commerce. Roman engineers had built roads that connected every corner of the island, while Roman architects had raised amphitheatres, baths, and temples that rivaled those in Italy itself. The native Britons had been thoroughly Romanized, adopting Latin names, Roman dress, and Roman customs. Many served in the imperial administration or the legions, and had never known any other way of life. But this prosperity had always depended on the military might of Rome. Hadrian's Wall in the north held back the Pictish tribes of Scotland, while naval patrols in the Channel discouraged raids from across the sea. Roman diplomacy kept the Irish kingdoms at bay, while Roman gold bought the loyalty of friendly chieftains along the frontiers. Without the legions, this entire defensive system collapsed almost overnight. The immediate crisis came not from external enemies, but from within. The Romano-British cities, suddenly deprived of imperial subsidies and military protection, found themselves unable to maintain even basic services. The complex administrative machinery that had governed the province required a steady flow of trained personnel from across the empire. When that flow stopped, local government began to break down almost immediately. Tax collection, which had funded everything from road maintenance to grain distributions, became sporadic and then ceased entirely in many areas. The professional civil service that had administered justice, regulated trade, and coordinated public works simply evaporated as its members fled to more secure positions elsewhere in the empire. Within a decade of the withdrawal, Many cities were struggling to perform even basic functions like maintaining water supplies and repairing walls. The economic consequences were even more severe. Britain's prosperity had been built on its integration into the broader Roman economy. British wool, silver, and grain were exported to markets across the empire, while British consumers imported everything from Spanish olive oil to Chinese silk. When the imperial trade networks collapsed, Britain suddenly found itself cut off from the wider world, forced to rely entirely on its own resources. The problem was that 4 centuries of Roman rule had created an economy that was utterly dependent on imports. The skills needed to produce many basic goods, from pottery to metalwork to fine textiles, had been concentrated in other parts of the empire. British craftsmen had specialised in producing raw materials for export, not finished goods for local consumption. When the trade routes closed, many communities found themselves unable to maintain even their pre-Roman standard of living. The social fabric of Romano-British society began to unravel as well. The Roman class system, with its complex hierarchy of citizens, freedmen and slaves, had provided stability and order for centuries. But this system only functioned as long as there was a strong central authority to enforce it. When imperial power collapsed, the bonds that held society together began to weaken and then snap entirely. The Romano-British aristocracy, who had served as the backbone of provincial government, found themselves in an impossible position. They had been trained to administer an empire, not to govern an independent kingdom. Their wealth was tied up in estates that depended on long-distance trade. Their authority derived from positions in an imperial hierarchy that no longer existed. Many fled to Gaul or other parts of the empire that remained under Roman control, taking their wealth and expertise with them. Those who remained faced an even more daunting challenge: how to maintain civilization in the face of growing barbarism. The cities that had been the centers of Roman culture began to empty as their populations fled to the countryside. The great public buildings, the forums, the baths, the amphitheaters, fell into disrepair as no one could afford to maintain them. Within a generation, many of these monuments to Roman engineering had become ruins, their stones scavenged for use in crude fortifications. The countryside fared little better. The villa system that had been the foundation of rural prosperity depended on a complex network of trade relationships and administrative support. When that network collapsed, many villas were simply abandoned by their owners, who either fled abroad or retreated to more defensible positions. The elaborate agricultural systems that had made Britain one of Rome's richest provinces, the irrigation networks, the planned crop rotations, the selective breeding programs, gradually fell apart as no one had the knowledge or resources to maintain them. Into this power vacuum came new players, some more welcome than others. Local strongmen began to assert control over their immediate neighborhoods, offering protection in exchange for loyalty and tribute. Some of these were descendants of the old Romano-British aristocracy, trying to maintain their authority through force rather than imperial appointment. Others were military commanders who had served in the legions and understood the importance of disciplined troops and secure fortifications. But many of the new power brokers came from very different backgrounds. Celtic chieftains, whose ancestors had been conquered by Rome centuries earlier, began to reassert traditional claims to tribal territories. Warriors from Ireland and Scotland, seeing opportunity in British weakness, launched raids that gradually turned into permanent settlements. Most ominously, Saxon and Anglo mercenaries, initially hired to help defend against other barbarian raids, began to realize that they were strong enough to take what they wanted, rather than accepting payment for their services. The transformation of post-Roman Britain was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual slide into chaos that took place over several generations. In some areas, particularly in the west and north where Roman influence had been weaker, the transition was relatively smooth. Local chieftains simply resumed authority they had never entirely given up, while traditional Celtic customs replaced Roman law and administration. But in the heavily Romanized areas of the south and east, the collapse was devastating. Cities that had housed tens of thousands of people were reduced to tiny settlements huddled within decaying walls. Trade networks that had connected Britain to markets across the known world contracted to local barter systems. The complex crafts and technologies that had sustained Roman civilization were lost as masters died without being able to pass on their knowledge to apprentices. Perhaps most tragically, the very idea of civilization began to fade from memory. The generation that had lived under Roman rule clung desperately to what they could remember of imperial customs and institutions. But their children, born into a world of constant warfare and economic collapse, had never known anything but struggle and survival. To them, the old stories of Roman prosperity seemed like fairy tales, too fantastic to be believed. It was in this context of civilizational collapse that the first warrior leaders emerged, who would later be remembered as the inspiration for the Arthurian legends. These were not knights in shining armor fighting for noble ideals, but desperate men leading desperate people in a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. They fought not to establish a perfect kingdom, but to preserve whatever fragments of their world they could save from the growing darkness. The historical sources for this period are frustratingly sparse. The Romano-British chronicles that had recorded events for centuries simply stopped being written as literacy declined, and the administrative structures that had supported scholarship collapsed. What little we know comes from scattered references in later sources, archaeological evidence, and the oral traditions that eventually gave birth to the Arthurian romances. But what emerges from this fragmentary evidence is a picture of a society under extraordinary stress, struggling to adapt to a new and hostile world. The men and women who lived through this period were forced to reinvent civilization almost from scratch, creating new institutions and new ways of life that would eventually evolve into medieval England. They were the bridge between the classical world of Rome and the medieval world of knights and castles, though they could never have imagined how their struggles would be remembered by later generations. Among these warrior leaders, if the sources can be trusted, was a figure known to Welsh tradition as Arthur, not a king in any medieval sense, but a war chief who managed to unite various British tribes and Romano-British communities against the Saxon invasion. His victories, if they really occurred, would have represented a brief moment of hope in an otherwise dark period, a demonstration that the barbarians could be defeated and civilization preserved. But Arthur's world, whether he existed or not, was one where survival required constant vigilance and terrible choices. It was a world where a leader's worth was measured not by his noble ideals, but by his ability to keep his people alive through another winter. It was a world where the difference between civilization and barbarism often came down to the strength of a warrior's sword arm and the loyalty of his followers. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine those early post-Roman years when the future of an entire civilization hung in the balance. The great cities were dying, the roads were cracking, and wolves prowled through abandoned villas. Yet somewhere in this darkness, men and women were laying the foundations for legends that would endure for 15 centuries. They fought not for glory, but for survival, not for individual honor, but for the continuation of their people and their way of life. Their struggles would eventually give birth to the greatest legend in British history, though they could never have imagined how their desperate battles for survival would be transformed into tales of noble quests and perfect kingdoms. They were the real heroes behind the Arthur legend, ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with nothing but courage, cunning, and an unbreakable determination to endure. The morning mist clung to the Thames Valley as Hengist and his Saxon warriors pulled their longboats onto the muddy shore near what had once been the thriving Roman port of Londinium. The year was 449 CE, and these fierce Germanic tribesmen had not come as conquerors, but as invited guests, hired by the British leader Vortigern to help defend his territories against Pictish raiders from the north. Within a generation, these mercenaries would become masters of much of eastern Britain, and their descendants would rule kingdoms that stretched from the Humber to the Channel. The Saxon migration to Britain was not a single dramatic invasion, but a gradual process that unfolded over more than a century. It began with small groups of Germanic warriors serving as federati, allied troops hired to supplement local British forces. The practice was not new. Rome itself had long employed barbarian mercenaries to defend its frontiers. But in post-Roman Britain, where local authorities lacked the resources to maintain professional armies, the use of Saxon mercenaries quickly became a necessity rather than a convenience. The Saxons who came to Britain in these early waves were not the savage barbarians of later propaganda, but sophisticated warriors with their own military traditions and social codes. They came from the coastal regions of modern Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, areas that had been in contact with the Roman Empire for centuries through trade and diplomatic relations. Many had served in Roman armies and understood both Roman military techniques and Roman weaknesses. What distinguished the Saxons from earlier Germanic invaders was their maritime capability. While tribes like the Goths and Vandals had conquered their territories through land-based campaigns, the Saxons were master sailors who could strike anywhere along Britain's extensive coastline. Their longboats, clinker-built for speed and shallow draft, could navigate rivers and coastal waters that were impassable to larger vessels. This mobility made them ideal raiders, but also, from the British perspective, valuable allies against seaborne threats. The arrangement between British leaders and Saxon mercenaries initially seemed to work well for both parties. The Saxons provided effective military service, while the British supplied food, shelter, and payment in the form of land grants. Many of the early Saxon settlements were established in marginal areas that had been abandoned during the post-Roman economic collapse, so their presence actually helped to restore agricultural production and maintain local security. But the relationship was inherently unstable. The British leaders who hired Saxon mercenaries were themselves often little more than local strongmen with limited resources and questionable authority. When they proved unable to meet their obligations, providing adequate supplies, honouring land grants, or paying agreed-upon wages, the Saxons began to take what they needed by force. What had begun as a contractual relationship gradually evolved into something much more predatory. The transformation of Saxon mercenaries into Saxon settlers, and eventually Saxon rulers, followed a pattern that would be repeated throughout the former Roman Empire. Initial cooperation gave way to tension to conflict, and conflict to conquest. But in Britain, this process was complicated by the island's geography and the weakness of native resistance. Unlike Gaul, where Germanic invaders faced the remnants of Roman military organization, or Italy, where barbarian kings had to negotiate with established aristocracies, Britain offered the Saxons opportunities for virtually unlimited expansion. The key to Saxon success was not superior military technology. British warriors were often just as well armed and equipped, but superior military organization. The Saxon warbands were bound together by powerful personal loyalties between leaders and followers, relationships that had been forged in countless battles across Northern Europe. These bonds were reinforced by elaborate gift-giving ceremonies, shared feasts, and sworn oaths that created networks of mutual obligation stronger than any contract or treaty. British resistance to Saxon expansion was hampered by the same political fragmentation that had made hiring Saxon mercenaries necessary in the first place. The old Romano-British administrative structure had collapsed, leaving individual cities and regions to fend for themselves. Some areas were controlled by traditional Celtic chieftains who had reasserted ancient tribal claims. Others were ruled by Romano-British aristocrats trying to maintain imperial traditions. Still others had fallen under the control of military strongmen with no particular political philosophy beyond the acquisition and retention of power. This political chaos made coordinated resistance to Saxon expansion almost impossible. While the Saxons could concentrate their forces and strike at isolated British settlements, the British could rarely unite enough forces to challenge Saxon expansion directly. Individual battles might be won or lost, but the overall strategic advantage lay with the more unified and disciplined Saxon warbands. The process of Saxon conquest was also facilitated by the economic and social disruption that had followed the Roman withdrawal. Many Romano-British communities had been weakened by decades of declining trade, administrative breakdown, and internal conflict. When Saxon raiders appeared, these communities often lacked the resources or organization to mount effective resistance. Some chose to flee rather than fight, abandoning their settlements and seeking refuge in more defensible locations. Others chose collaboration over resistance, accepting Saxon overlordship in exchange for protection and the promise of continued local autonomy. This pragmatic approach was often the wisest course for communities that lacked the military strength to resist effectively. Under Saxon rule, local life might continue much as before, with traditional customs and laws maintained as long as they did not conflict with Saxon interests. The cultural impact of Saxon settlement was profound but uneven. In areas of heavy Saxon immigration, Germanic customs, language, and law gradually displaced Romano-British traditions. But in regions where Saxons remained a minority, even if a ruling minority, British customs often persisted alongside Saxon innovations. The result was a complex cultural mosaic that varied dramatically from region to region. Language provides perhaps the clearest evidence of this cultural transformation. In the heavily Saxon areas of eastern and southern England, Old English gradually became the dominant language, with Latin surviving only in religious contexts and British Celtic languages retreating to marginal areas. But in the west and north, British languages continued to flourish, and even in Saxon kingdoms, Celtic place names and legal terms often persisted for centuries. Religion was another area where Saxon settlement created complex patterns of change and continuity. Many of the early Saxon settlers were pagan, worshipping gods like Woden and Thor, who were familiar throughout the Germanic world. Their arrival reinvigorated pagan practices that had been suppressed during the Roman Christian period. But Christianity had put down deep roots in Britain during the 4th century, and many Romano-British communities remained stubbornly Christian despite Saxon political dominance. This religious diversity created opportunities for conflict, but also for accommodation. Some Saxon leaders converted to Christianity as a means of securing better relations with their British subjects. Others maintained traditional Germanic paganism while tolerating Christian practice among their subjects. Still others adopted syncretic religious practices that blended Christian and pagan elements in ways that would have scandalized both Orthodox Christians and traditional pagans. The economic impact of Saxon settlement was equally complex. In some areas, Saxon agricultural techniques and settlement patterns led to increased productivity and population growth. The Saxons were skilled farmers who introduced new crops and farming methods that were well adapted to British conditions. Their settlements often grew into prosperous villages that became the foundations for later medieval communities. But Saxon expansion also disrupted existing economic networks and trade relationships. The complex commercial systems that had connected Roman Britain to markets across Europe collapsed as Saxon raids made long-distance travel dangerous, and political fragmentation made trade agreements unreliable. Many Romano-British crafts and industries disappeared as the skilled artisans who had practiced them were killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. The archaeological evidence for this period reveals a picture of dramatic social and economic change. The elaborate Romano-British villas, with their sophisticated heating systems, decorative mosaics, and imported luxuries, were abandoned or converted to much simpler uses. The mass-produced pottery that had been ubiquitous during the Roman period was replaced by cruder handmade ceramics. Coinage, which had been the foundation of Roman commercial life, virtually disappeared in many areas as barter systems replaced monetary exchange. But archaeology also reveals evidence of continuity and adaptation. Some Romano-British settlements survived the Saxon period and eventually grew into important medieval towns. Christian churches continued to function in many areas, often serving as focal points for communities that maintained Romano-British identity despite Saxon political control. Traditional British crafts like metalworking and textile production continued, often incorporating Saxon stylistic influences that created distinctive hybrid art forms. It was against this background of political fragmentation, cultural transformation, and economic disruption that the legendary Arthur supposedly emerged as a leader capable of uniting British resistance to Saxon expansion. Whether such a figure actually existed is less important than the fact that conditions in late 5th and early 6th century Britain created a desperate need for exactly this kind of leadership. The Arthur of legend is often portrayed as a king ruling from a magnificent capital, but the historical Arthur, if he existed, would have been something very different. A war leader trying to coordinate resistance among fractious British tribes and communities. A diplomat attempting to forge alliances between groups that had been enemies for generations. A strategist seeking to turn British military weaknesses into Saxon vulnerabilities. This Arthur would have faced challenges that would have tested even the most capable leader. His followers would have included Romano-British aristocrats clinging to imperial traditions, Celtic chieftains asserting ancient tribal claims, and ordinary farmers and townspeople who simply wanted to be left alone to rebuild their lives. Forging these diverse groups into an effective fighting force would have required extraordinary political and military skills. The military challenges were equally daunting. Saxon war bands were experienced, disciplined, and led by chiefs who had proven themselves in countless battles. They were fighting on terrain they had chosen, supported by established settlements, and motivated by the prospect of permanent conquest. British forces, by contrast, were fighting a defensive war with limited resources, uncertain supply lines, and commanders whose authority was often questioned by their own subordinates. Yet the very desperation of the British situation may have created opportunities for a leader capable of exploiting them. Saxon expansion had created a common enemy that transcended traditional British divisions. The threat of cultural and religious extinction provided powerful motivation for resistance, and the Saxons themselves, confident in their military superiority, may have become overextended and vulnerable to coordinated British counterattacks. The legendary Battle of Baden Hill, where Arthur is supposed to have won his greatest victory over the Saxons, may represent exactly this kind of opportunity. A moment when British forces managed to achieve tactical surprise and strategic coordination sufficient to inflict a significant defeat on Saxon forces. Such a victory, even if temporary, would have had enormous psychological impact, demonstrating that Saxon conquest was not inevitable and inspiring further resistance. But even the most brilliant victory could only delay rather than prevent the ultimate Saxon triumph. The underlying factors that favoured Saxon expansion, superior organisation, unified command, and growing numerical strength, remained unchanged. A British war leader might win battles, but winning the war would have required transforming British society itself, creating new institutions and new forms of unity that could match Saxon advantages. As you sink deeper into peaceful sleep, imagine the smoky halls where Saxon chiefs planned their next raids, the crumbling Roman villas where British nobles debated desperate strategies, the muddy camps where warriors from both sides sharpened their weapons and wondered whether they would see another dawn. This was a world without mercy, where survival depended on strength, cunning, and luck in roughly equal measure. In this harsh landscape, legends were born not from noble ideals, but from desperate necessity. The heroes of this age were not perfect knights, but flawed men and women struggling to preserve whatever fragments of civilization they could save from the storm. Their victories were temporary, their defeats often final, but their memory would inspire tales of glory that would echo through the centuries long after their names were forgotten. In the pre-dawn darkness of a cold spring morning in 516 CE, a British warband crept through the dense forests surrounding Mount Baden. Their leader, a man known to his followers as Arthur, moved silently between the trees, checking weapons and whispering final instructions to his captains. Somewhere ahead, through the morning mist, lay the largest Saxon army ever assembled in Britain. Perhaps 3,000 warriors, drawn from kingdoms across the island, confident that this battle would finally break the last British resistance. Arthur was not a king in any sense that later generations would understand. He wore no crown, ruled no fixed territory, and commanded no formal army. Instead, he was what the Welsh would later call a Pendragon, a supreme war leader chosen by alliance and acclamation to coordinate resistance among the fractured British kingdoms. His authority depended not on blood or divine right, but on his ability to win battles and his skill at managing the complex web of loyalties, rivalries, and ancient grudges that divided his followers. The man, who may have been Arthur, emerged from the chaos of early 6th century Britain as one of several war leaders attempting to organize British resistance to Saxon expansion. The sources that mention him, primarily the Welsh monk Gildas writing some 30 years later, are frustratingly vague about his origins and background. He may have been a Romano-British aristocrat trying to preserve imperial traditions, or a Celtic chieftain reviving ancient tribal claims, or simply a successful warrior whose abilities transcended traditional social boundaries, aired in Roman techniques, others following Celtic customs, still others adapting to new circumstances as best they could. They lacked unified command structures, standardized equipment, and reliable supply systems. Most critically, they were fighting on multiple fronts, unable to concentrate their forces while the Saxons could choose when and where to attack. Arthur's genius, if the later sources can be trusted, lay in turning these disadvantages into advantages through superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, and strategic patience. Instead of meeting Saxon armies in the kind of large-scale battles that favored better organized forces, he seems to have developed a form of warfare that emphasized mobility, surprise, and the exploitation of local knowledge. The 12 battles attributed to Arthur by later sources suggest a campaign strategy that avoided decisive confrontations while gradually wearing down Saxon strength. Battles at river crossings, forest clearings, and hilltop fortresses indicate a leader who understood how to use terrain to offset numerical and organizational disadvantages. The repeated mentions of cavalry suggest that Arthur may have maintained the Romano-British tradition of mounted warfare at a time when many British forces were fighting on foot. But Arthur's most important innovation may have been political rather than military. The evidence suggests that he managed to create, however briefly, something approaching a unified British command structure. The various British kingdoms and tribes that had been fighting independently began to coordinate their efforts, sharing intelligence, supporting each other's campaigns, and accepting unified strategic direction. This political unification was probably more important than any individual battle victory. For the first time since the Roman withdrawal, British resistance was organized on a scale that could match Saxon expansion. Local Saxon raids might succeed, but larger Saxon armies found themselves facing coordinated opposition, that could respond quickly to threats and exploit Saxon weaknesses. The climax of this resistance came at the Battle of Badon Hill, where Arthur supposedly inflicted such a decisive defeat on the Saxons that their expansion was halted for a generation. The location of this battle is unknown, and its details are largely legendary, but its impact on subsequent events seems to have been real. Saxon expansion into the western parts of Britain ceased for several decades, while British communities in the east managed to maintain their independence despite Saxon political control. The victory at Badon Hill, whatever its tactical details, represented something unprecedented in post-Roman British history. A British force large enough and well organised enough to defeat a major Saxon army in a pitched battle. This required not just military skill, but the kind of political unity that had been absent from British resistance for generations. But the very success of Arthur's coalition contained the seeds of its own destruction. The unity that had been forged in the desperate struggle against Saxon expansion began to fragment once that immediate threat had been contained. The various British kingdoms and tribes that had accepted Arthur's leadership during the crisis began to reassert their independence once victory had been achieved. The sources suggest that Arthur's authority depended heavily on his personal relationships with other British leaders. These relationships, forged in the heat of battle and sustained by shared victories, were probably strong enough to survive minor disagreements and temporary setbacks. But they were not institutionalized in ways that could survive Arthur's own death or major strategic failures. The later legends speak of Arthur's downfall in terms of personal betrayal and moral failure, the adultery of Guinevere, the rebellion of Mordred, the dissolution of the Round Table. The historical reality was probably more prosaic. The gradual erosion of the political coalition that had made unified resistance possible. Without the external pressure of Saxon expansion, the internal divisions among British communities reasserted themselves. The archaeological evidence for this period suggests a brief but significant improvement in British fortunes during the early decades of the 6th century. Hill forts that had been abandoned during the Saxon advance were reoccupied and strengthened. British pottery and metalwork from this period show renewed sophistication and artistic confidence. Some Romano-British cities seem to have experienced a limited revival, with evidence of new building and population growth. But this revival was temporary and geographically limited. While the western parts of Britain experienced something of a renaissance under Arthur's leadership, the eastern regions remained under Saxon control. The political and cultural unity that Arthur had achieved was fragile and ultimately unsustainable in the face of the deeper changes that had transformed British society since the Roman withdrawal. The economic foundations of Arthur's success were also precarious. The revival of British resistance required resources, weapons, horses, supplies for armies, rewards for loyal followers. These resources had to be extracted from communities that were already struggling with the economic disruption of the post-Roman period. The burden of supporting Arthur's coalition may have been sustainable during the crisis years when Saxon conquest seemed imminent, but it became more difficult to justify once that threat had receded. The military foundations were equally unstable. Arthur's forces seem to have depended heavily on a relatively small number of elite warriors, the mounted troops who could respond quickly to Saxon threats, and the veteran infantry who could anchor defensive positions. These men required constant training, expensive equipment, and regular replacement as casualties mounted. Maintaining such forces required a level of economic and political organization that exceeded the capabilities of most post-Roman British communities. Religious and cultural factors may also have contributed to the eventual collapse of Arthur's coalition. The British resistance included both Christian and pagan elements, Romano-British aristocrats and Celtic tribal leaders, communities that had embraced Saxon cultural influences, and others that rejected them entirely. Arthur's success had depended on his ability to minimize these differences in the face of a common enemy. But once that enemy was contained, these underlying tensions reasserted themselves. The death of Arthur, whether from battle, disease, or old age, would have precipitated a succession crisis that exposed all these underlying weaknesses. Unlike established kingdoms with clear rules of inheritance, Arthur's coalition depended on personal relationships and military success. No obvious successor possessed both the military reputation and the political connections necessary to maintain unity among the various British factions. The decades following Arthur's death saw the gradual dissolution of unified British resistance and the resumption of Saxon expansion. The kingdoms and tribes that had cooperated under Arthur's leadership returned to their traditional feuds and rivalries. The hill forts and defensive positions that had been maintained through collective effort were abandoned or left to decay. The cultural and economic revival that had characterized Arthur's period gradually gave way to renewed fragmentation and decline. Yet the memory of Arthur's achievements continued to inspire British resistance for generations. The idea that unified action could defeat Saxon expansion became a powerful legend that motivated later British leaders and sustained hope during the darkest periods of Saxon dominance. The historical Arthur may have been a pragmatic war leader whose success was temporary and limited, but the legendary Arthur became a symbol of British potential that transcended the failures of any individual leader. As you drift into deeper sleep, imagine the hilltop fortresses where Arthur's warriors kept watch through the long nights, scanning the horizons for Saxon warbands while dreaming of homes they might never see again. These men fought not for glory or conquest, but for survival, their own, their families, and their civilizations. Their victories were temporary, their unity fragile, but their courage in the face of overwhelming odds planted the seeds of a legend that would grow into the greatest story ever told about the struggle between hope and despair, order and chaos, light and darkness. The real Arthur, if he existed, was not a perfect king ruling a perfect kingdom, but a flawed man leading flawed people in an imperfect cause. Yet sometimes, in the darkest moments of history, that is exactly the kind of hero the world needs most. The Great Hall at Cadbury Castle was nothing like the Camelot of later legend. Built within the ancient ramparts of an Iron Age hill fort, it was a crude wooden structure with a thatched roof and walls that let in the wind and rain. Smoke from the central hearth filled the air with the smell of burning wood and roasting meat. While Arthur's warriors sat on rough benches, their weapons within easy reach, and their eyes constantly scanning the darkness beyond the doorway, this was the reality of royal life in 6th century Britain, not the marble palaces and golden thrones of romance, but a harsh existence where survival depended on the strength of your sword arm and the loyalty of your followers. The men who gathered in Arthur's hall were not noble knights, but scarred veterans who had learned their trade in the bitter school of Saxon warfare. They wore leather and mail, not plate armor, and their weapons were practical tools of war rather than ceremonial symbols of chivalry. The so-called kingdom that Arthur may have ruled was not a realm in any medieval sense, but a loose confederation of tribal territories, Roman estates, and fortified strongholds held together by personal loyalty and military necessity. There were no fixed borders, no central administration, and no permanent capital. Arthur's court moved constantly from one defensive position to another, following the seasonal patterns of warfare and the shifting threats from Saxon expansion. The daily routine of Arthur's warriors would have been dominated by the basic requirements of survival in a hostile environment. Each dawn brought the possibility of Saxon raids, internal disputes, or simple accidents that could prove fatal in a world without medical care. Weapons and armor required constant maintenance, horses needed daily care, and the fortifications that protected each settlement demanded regular repair and improvement. Food was a constant concern in this harsh world. The agricultural systems that had sustained Romano-British prosperity had collapsed along with the imperial administration, leaving most communities dependent on subsistence farming supplemented by hunting, raiding, and whatever trade could be maintained despite the dangers of travel. Arthur's warriors ate when they could, roasted meat when successful raids provided livestock, coarse bread when grain was available, and thin gruel during the lean months of late winter and early spring. The weapons and equipment of Arthur's time reflected the practical requirements of 6th century warfare rather than the romantic ideals of later chivalry. Swords were rare and precious, owned only by the wealthiest warriors, and passed down through generations as family heirlooms. Most fighting men carried spears, sea axes, long knives, and wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses. Armour consisted primarily of leather jerkins, with occasional additions of mail for those who could afford it. The legendary Excalibur, if it existed at all, would have been not a magical weapon, but a particularly fine example of 6th century sword-making, perhaps a blade forged by a skilled Romano-British smith using techniques preserved from the imperial period, or possibly a Saxon weapon captured in battle and re-hilted with British decorations. Such weapons were symbols of status and authority, but their real value lay in their practical effectiveness rather than any supernatural properties. The Round Table of Legend, if it had any historical basis, was probably nothing more than the circular arrangement of benches in Arthur's Hall, a practical solution to the problem of managing the competing egos and traditional rivalries of his various followers. In a world where questions of precedence could lead to blood feuds, arranging seating so that no man could claim a place of greater honor than another was a shrewd political innovation rather than a mystical symbol. The warriors who gathered around this table were a diverse group, reflecting the complex political realities of post-Roman Britain. Some were descendants of Romano-British aristocrats, educated men who could read Latin and remembered the old imperial customs. Others were Celtic chieftains, whose families had ruled tribal territories for centuries before the Roman conquest. Still others were simply successful fighters who had risen through the ranks based on skill and courage rather than birth or education. These men brought with them different military traditions, different concepts of honor and loyalty, and different ideas about the proper relationship between leaders and followers. Romano-British nobles expected the formal hierarchy and bureaucratic procedures of imperial administration. Celtic chiefs demanded the personal bonds and ritual obligations of traditional warrior culture. Common soldiers wanted reliable leadership, regular payment, and fair treatment in the distribution of loot and land. Managing these competing expectations required extraordinary diplomatic skills. Arthur had to be simultaneously a Roman general, a Celtic war chief, and a pragmatic politician who understood that his authority depended on his ability to satisfy the diverse needs of his followers. The legendary accounts of his court, with their emphasis on equality, justice, and mutual respect, may preserve some memory of his success in balancing these competing demands. The women of Arthur's world faced even harsher challenges than the men. The collapse of Roman law had eliminated many of the legal protections that women had enjoyed during the imperial period, while the constant warfare made every settlement a potential target for raiders who showed no mercy to non-combatants. Women had to be prepared to defend themselves and their children, to flee at a moment's notice, and to rebuild their lives repeatedly as the fortunes of war shifted. The legendary Guinevere, if she existed, would have been not a pampered queen, but a warrior's wife, whose survival depended on her ability to manage a complex household under siege conditions. She would have been responsible for provisioning Arthur's followers, maintaining the domestic economy of his strongholds, and serving as his representative when he was absent on campaign. Such women often wielded considerable political influence, serving as advisors to their husbands and as crucial links in the networks of marriage alliances that bound the various British factions together. The religious life of Arthur's Britain was equally complex and challenging. Christianity had put down deep roots during the Roman period, but the collapse of imperial administration had left the church without central organisation or adequate resources. Many communities were served by ill-educated priests who preserved Christian ritual without necessarily understanding Christian theology, while remote areas often lacked any clerical presence at all. At the same time, traditional Celtic religious practices had experienced a revival as Saxon paganism challenged Christian dominance. Sacred groves, holy wells, and ancient stone circles once again became centres of religious activity, often with Christian symbols awkwardly grafted onto pagan traditions. The result was a religious landscape that would have seemed chaotic and syncretistic to both Orthodox Christians and traditional pagans. Arthur himself, if he existed, probably navigated this religious complexity with the same pragmatic flexibility that characterized his political and military policies. The sources suggest that he was nominally Christian. The Welsh traditions emphasize his role as a defender of Christian Britain against pagan invaders. But he would have had to maintain the loyalty of followers who held a wide range of religious beliefs, from devout Christianity to militant paganism to various forms of folk religion that blended elements from multiple traditions. The legendary Merlin may preserve some memory of the religious advisors who served Arthur's court. Such figures would not have been wizards in the medieval sense, but learned men who combined practical skills, literacy, knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, familiarity with medical herbs, with religious authority and political wisdom. In a world where most people were illiterate and superstitious, a man who could read the stars, predict the weather, and provide medical treatment would indeed have seemed to possess magical powers. The economic foundations of Arthur's power were precarious and constantly shifting. Unlike established kingdoms with regular tax systems and productive agricultural territories, Arthur's confederation depended on a complex mixture of tribute, raiding, trade, and direct agricultural production. The communities that acknowledged his leadership provided supplies and warriors in exchange for protection, but these arrangements were often informal and temporary. Raiding provided another important source of resources, both through direct seizure of Saxon wealth and through the capture of livestock, weapons, and slaves. Such raids had to be carefully planned and executed to avoid provoking massive Saxon retaliation, while the distribution of captured goods required diplomatic skill to maintain unity among Arthur's diverse followers. Trade, though limited by the dangerous conditions of the time, provided access to goods that could not be produced locally. Arthur's territories probably included communities that specialized in metalworking, pottery production, textile manufacture, and other crafts that could be exchanged for food, weapons, and raw materials. Maintaining these trade networks required both military protection for merchants and diplomatic relations with trading partners who might be neutral or even hostile in political terms. The agricultural economy of Arthur's time was primarily subsistence-based, with most communities producing just enough food to sustain their own populations. The large-scale commercial agriculture that had characterized Roman Britain had collapsed along with the imperial market system, forcing communities to return to the more primitive but more sustainable farming practices of the pre-Roman period. This agricultural transformation had profound social and political implications. The villa estates that had been the foundation of Romano-British prosperity were abandoned or converted to much simpler uses. The complex systems of tenant farming and agricultural specialization that had supported Roman urbanism gave way to village-based subsistence agriculture. The result was a more egalitarian but also more impoverished society, where differences in wealth were less pronounced, but overall living standards were much lower. The military campaigns of Arthur's period were shaped by these economic constraints. armies had to be small enough to live off the land, mobile enough to avoid being pinned down by superior Saxon forces, and successful enough to capture the resources needed to sustain further operations. The great battles of later legend were probably rare events, while most military activity consisted of raids, skirmishes, and sieges of fortified positions. The fortifications of Arthur's time reflected both the military requirements of the period and the limited resources available for construction. The massive stone walls and elaborate gatehouses of later medieval castles were beyond the technological and economic capabilities of 6th century Britain. Instead, Arthur's strongholds were typically wooden palisades built on naturally defensible positions, hilltops, river islands, or rocky outcrops that could be fortified with relatively simple earthworks and timber construction. These fortifications were designed for defense against raiding parties rather than systematic siege warfare. They provided secure bases for Arthur's mobile forces while offering refuge for local populations during Saxon attacks. The most important requirement was not impregnability, but rapid construction and easy abandonment if strategic circumstances changed. The legendary Camelot, if it had any historical basis, was probably one of these hilltop fortresses, perhaps Cadbury Castle in Somerset, which shows evidence of extensive 6th century rebuilding, or one of the other British strongholds that archaeological evidence suggests were reoccupied during Arthur's time. These sites would have been impressive in their day, but their timber and earthwork construction left little trace for later archaeologists to discover. The daily life within these fortresses would have been harsh and uncomfortable by modern standards. Living spaces were cramped and smoky, sanitation was primitive, and privacy was virtually non-existent. Warriors, servants, animals, and supplies were all crowded together within the defensive perimeter, creating conditions that would have been ideal for the spread of disease and social tensions. Yet these communities also developed strong bonds of mutual dependence and shared purpose. Men and women who lived through the dangers and hardships of Arthur's time formed relationships of extraordinary intensity and loyalty. The legendary Fellowship of the Round Table may preserve some memory of these bonds, though the reality would have been far more complex and conflicted than later romances suggested. The cultural life of Arthur's Britain was equally challenging and complex. The collapse of Roman educational systems had created a largely illiterate society where knowledge was preserved through oral tradition rather than written records. Bards and storytellers played crucial roles in maintaining historical memory, legal precedents, and cultural identity, while their performances provided entertainment and inspiration during the long winter nights. The artistic traditions of the period reflected this mixture of preservation and innovation. Celtic decorative styles experienced a revival as craftsmen drew on pre-Roman traditions that had survived in marginal areas. At the same time, Romano-British artistic influences persisted in some areas, creating hybrid styles that combined classical and Celtic elements in distinctive ways. The legendary Camlan, Arthur's final battle, probably represents the breakdown of the political and military coalition that had made his success possible. As the immediate Saxon threat receded, the various factions that had united under Arthur's leadership began to reassert their independence and pursue their own agendas. What had been a unified resistance movement gradually fragmented into competing groups, each claiming to represent Arthur's true legacy. The historical Arthur, if he existed, probably died not in a single climactic battle, but in one of the countless skirmishes that characterize 6th century warfare. His death would have precipitated a succession crisis that exposed all the underlying tensions within his coalition, leading to civil war among his former followers and the collapse of organized British resistance. As you settle deeper into peaceful sleep, imagine the smoky halls where Arthur's warriors gathered on winter nights, sharing stories of battles fought and victories won, while the wind howled around their crude fortifications. These men lived on the edge of disaster, never knowing whether dawn would bring news of Saxon attacks internal betrayals, or simply the slow, grinding poverty that was their constant companion. Yet they persevered, bound together by loyalty, courage, and the desperate hope that their sacrifices might preserve something worth preserving. Their world was brutal and their lives were short, but their struggle against overwhelming odds created the foundation for legends that would inspire courage and hope for generations to come. The real Camelot was not a shining city, but a muddy hilltop fortress, and the real Round Table was not a mystical symbol, but a practical arrangement of rough wooden benches. But the ideals they represented, unity in the face of division, hope in the face of despair, civilization in the face of barbarism, were as real as the mud and iron of their daily existence. The fires that burned across the valley of Camlan on that terrible day in 537 CE marked not just the end of a battle, but the death of a dream. Where Arthur's united forces had once stood together against Saxon expansion, now British fought British in a civil war that would destroy everything the great war leader had built. The man who may have been Arthur lay dying among the corpses of his former allies, while his kingdom collapsed into the same fractured chaos from which he had struggled to lift it. The decline of Arthur's coalition did not happen overnight, but was the result of accumulating tensions that his personal authority had suppressed but never resolved. The very success of his resistance to Saxon expansion had created new problems that proved even more difficult to solve than the original external threat. Victory, it seemed, was more dangerous to British unity than defeat had ever been. The first crack in Arthur's coalition appeared within a few years of the great victory at Badon Hill. With the immediate Saxon threat contained, the various British kingdoms and tribal groups that had accepted Arthur's war leadership began to question why they should continue to subordinate their interests to a confederation that no longer served an obvious purpose. The Romano-British aristocrats wanted to restore imperial administration and law. The Celtic chieftains sought to revive traditional tribal boundaries, and the common warriors, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, demanded rewards that the Confederation's limited resources could not provide. Arthur's response to these challenges revealed both his political skills and their ultimate limitations. Rather than attempting to transform his war leadership into a formal monarchy, he seems to have tried to maintain unity through a complex system of personal relationships, marriage alliances, and the careful distribution of captured wealth. This approach worked as long as there were regular victories to celebrate and spoils to distribute, but it became increasingly difficult to sustain as military activity declined and economic pressures mounted. The archaeological evidence from this period suggests that Arthur's strongholds continued to be occupied and even expanded during the decades following Badon Hill. Sites like Cadbury Castle show evidence of extensive construction projects that would have required significant resources and coordinated labour. But these improvements were probably paid for by the wealth captured during the successful campaigns against the Saxons, and when that source of income was exhausted, the economic foundations of Arthur's power began to crumble. The problem was fundamental. Arthur's confederation had been created for war, but it was trying to survive in peace. The military organisation that had made British resistance possible was expensive to maintain and difficult to justify when there were no immediate enemies to fight. The warriors who had followed Arthur against the Saxons were not farmers or craftsmen, but professional soldiers who expected regular employment and steady rewards for their service. Some of these warriors probably sought employment as mercenaries in conflicts elsewhere in post-Roman Europe. Others may have turned to raiding British communities that had not been part of Arthur's coalition, creating new sources of instability and conflict. Still others remained in Arthur's service, but became increasingly restless and demanding as their prospects for advancement diminished. The legendary accounts of Arthur's later years, with their emphasis on internal intrigue and moral decay, may preserve some memory of these growing tensions. The stories of adultery, betrayal, and broken oaths that dominate the later Arthurian romances probably reflect the real political and personal conflicts that tore apart Arthur's coalition from within. The figure of Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son who becomes his greatest enemy in the legends, may represent the broader problem of succession that plagued all early medieval kingdoms. Arthur's authority was personal rather than institutional, based on his individual military and political skills rather than any formal constitutional framework. When questions arose about who would inherit this authority, there were no established procedures for resolving the resulting conflicts peacefully. The historical Mordred, if he existed, was probably one of several potential successors to Arthur's leadership, perhaps a son, nephew, or adopted heir who commanded the loyalty of some faction within the Confederation. The civil war that destroyed Arthur's kingdom may have begun as a succession dispute, but quickly escalated into a broader conflict that divided the entire British resistance movement. The involvement of Saxon kingdoms in this civil war seems almost certain, though their role was probably more complex than the later legends suggest. Rather than simply supporting one side or the other, different Saxon rulers probably made alliances with different British factions, seeing an opportunity to exploit British divisions for their own advantage. The result was a series of interconnected conflicts that pitted British against British, while gradually expanding Saxon influence throughout the former Confederation. The breakdown of Arthur's coalition also had important religious dimensions. The British resistance had always included both Christian and pagan elements, but these differences had been suppressed in the face of the common Saxon threat. As that threat receded and political unity weakened, religious divisions reasserted themselves with devastating consequences. Some British communities may have seen Arthur's death as divine punishment for his failure to create a properly Christian kingdom, while others blamed Christian influence for weakening traditional British military virtues. The result was a series of religious conflicts that further fragmented British resistance and made cooperation against Saxon expansion virtually impossible. The economic consequences of the Civil War were even more severe than the political ones. The trade networks that Arthur had protected and encouraged were disrupted by renewed warfare, while agricultural production suffered, as farmers were forced to abandon their fields and seek refuge in fortified positions. The specialized crafts that had begun to revive during Arthur's reign declined, as the markets for their products disappeared, and the resources needed to support them were diverted to military purposes. Archaeological evidence from the late 6th century shows a marked decline in the quality and quantity of British material culture. The metalwork, pottery, and textile production that had characterized Arthur's period gave way to cruder goods that reflected both reduced resources and declining technical skills. Even the hill forts and defensive positions that had been the symbols of British resistance began to show signs of abandonment and decay. The Saxon response to British civil war was swift and decisive. Within a decade of Arthur's death, Saxon expansion had resumed with unprecedented vigor. The confederation that had taken Arthur decades to build was conquered piecemeal by Saxon armies that faced little coordinated resistance. Communities that had successfully defended themselves for generations were overrun or abandoned as their inhabitants fled westward. The conquest was not simply military, but cultural as well. Saxon settlement patterns, legal systems, and religious practices gradually replaced British traditions, even in areas where substantial British populations remained. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged from this period would dominate English history for the next 5 centuries, while British political independence survived only in the marginal areas of Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. Yet the memory of Arthur's achievements persisted even as his political legacy crumbled. The idea that British unity was possible, that Saxon expansion could be stopped, and that a just ruler could protect the weak against the strong became a powerful myth that sustained hope during the darkest periods of Saxon domination. The historical Arthur may have failed to create a lasting kingdom, but the legendary Arthur provided inspiration for future generations of British leaders. The transformation of historical memory into legendary narrative was probably already beginning during Arthur's own lifetime. Bards and storytellers who had celebrated his victories continued to sing his praises even after his death, gradually elaborating and embellishing their accounts to emphasize the moral and spiritual significance of his struggles. The Arthur who emerged from this process was not the pragmatic war leader of history, but the ideal king of myth, a figure who embodied all the virtues that his society valued and none of the flaws that had contributed to his downfall. This legendary Arthur served important psychological and political functions for the British communities that survived Saxon conquest. He provided a model of what British leadership could achieve under ideal circumstances, while his tragic fate offered an explanation for why such achievement had proved temporary. The promise of his eventual return gave hope that current sufferings were not permanent, and that justice would ultimately prevail. The religious dimensions of the Arthur legend also became more prominent as Christian influence spread throughout post-Roman Britain. The pagan elements that had probably characterized the historical Arthur were gradually suppressed or reinterpreted in Christian terms, while new stories emphasized his role as a defender of Christian civilization against heathen invaders. The quest for the Holy Grail, which became central to later Arthurian romance, probably reflects this Christianization of originally secular heroic traditions. The geographical spread of Arthurian legends provides some indication of the extent of Arthur's historical influence. Stories about Arthur are found throughout the former areas of British resistance, from Scotland to Cornwall, from Wales to Brittany. This suggests that his reputation was not merely local, but extended throughout the Celtic world, indicating achievements that were recognized across cultural and political boundaries. But the legends also reveal the limitations of Arthur's historical impact. The Arthur who appears in early Welsh sources is a war leader whose achievements were impressive but temporary, a hero whose victories were ultimately overshadowed by his defeats. It was only through later elaboration and embellishment that this historical figure was transformed into the perfect king of medieval romance. The contrast between the historical Arthur and the legendary one illuminates the broader transformation of post-Roman Britain from a classical civilization struggling to survive barbarian invasion to a medieval society that had absorbed and adapted to Germanic cultural influences. The real Arthur belonged to the classical world. He fought to preserve Romano-British civilization against Saxon barbarism. The legendary Arthur belonged to the medieval world. He embodied the chivalric ideals that would eventually characterize the very Saxon kingdoms that had destroyed his historical prototype. This transformation reflects one of the great ironies of European history. The civilization that Arthur died defending was ultimately absorbed by the civilization he died fighting. The Romano-British culture that he struggled to preserve disappeared, but the legends it created about his struggles became central to the identity of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that replaced it. The historical Arthur was forgotten, but the mythical Arthur became immortal. As you drift deeper into restful sleep, imagine the last gathering of Arthur's warriors in the ruins of Camelot, sharing final toasts and making final vows before setting out for the battle they knew would be their last. These men understood that they were fighting not for victory. That was no longer possible, but for memory, for the chance that their sacrifices might be remembered and their ideals preserved for future generations. They fought with the desperate courage of men who had nothing left to lose except their honor. And in losing everything else, they gained immortality. The kingdom they failed to save was forgotten, but the legend they created would inspire countless other kingdoms, other heroes, other dreams of what leadership could achieve when guided by justice, tempered by mercy, and sustained by hope. The hollow crown that Arthur wore in his final years was indeed empty of earthly power, but it was filled with something more enduring, promise that somewhere, somehow, the ideals he represented would find new champions and new expressions. The oaths that were broken at Camelot were indeed shattered, but the memory of what those oaths had promised would echo through the centuries, calling new generations to attempt what Arthur had attempted and to dream what Arthur had dreamed. In a monastery scriptorium in Wales, sometime around 830 CE, a monk named Nennius dipped his quill in ink and began to write the words that would resurrect a legend from the ashes of history. At that time, he recorded, Arthur fought against them in those days, together with the kings of the British, but he was their leader in battle. Nearly 3 centuries after the historical, Arthur had died in the mud of Camelot. His memory was being transformed from the fading recollections of defeated survivors into the eternal legend of the once and future king. The survival of Arthur's memory through the dark centuries that followed his death represents one of the most remarkable achievements of oral tradition in European history. In a world where literacy was rare and written records were constantly destroyed by warfare, the stories of Arthur's deeds were preserved by bards and storytellers who carried them from court to court, from generation to generation, gradually transforming historical memory into mythic truth. This transformation did not happen quickly or easily. The centuries following Arthur's death saw the progressive Saxon conquest of most of Britain, the absorption of surviving British communities into Germanic kingdoms, and the gradual displacement of Celtic culture by Anglo-Saxon traditions. The political world that Arthur had fought to preserve disappeared so completely that later generations could barely imagine what it had been like. Yet the memory of Arthur persisted in the marginal areas where British independence survived, in Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and Scotland. Here, in isolated valleys and remote monasteries, the old stories were told and retold, each generation adding new details and interpretations while preserving the essential narrative of the great king who had united the British against their enemies and would one day return to do so again. The Arthur who emerged from this process of oral transmission was simultaneously more and less than the historical original. More, because the storytellers gradually attributed to him every virtue that their society valued and every achievement that their people could imagine. Less, because the specific political and military circumstances that had shaped his historical career were forgotten or misunderstood by audiences who lived in a very different world. The earliest written sources for Arthur reveal this transformation already well underway. Nennius's Historia Brittonum, compiled around 830 CE, presents Arthur not as a king, but as a war leader, Dux Bellorum, who won 12 great battles against the Saxons, culminating in the victory at Baden Hill, where he supposedly killed 960 enemies single-handedly. This account preserves some plausible historical details, but already shows clear signs of legendary elaboration. Even more revealing is the Annales Cambriae, Welsh Annals, which records under the year 537 the Battle of Camelot, in which Arthur and Medraut fell. This brief entry, probably based on contemporary records, provides our best evidence for the historical Arthur's existence and death. But even here, the stark simplicity of the record hints at the tragedy that would become central to later Arthurian legend. The transformation of Arthur from history to legend accelerated during the 11th and 12th centuries as Celtic oral traditions encountered the sophisticated literary culture of medieval Europe. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, History of the Kings of Britain, completed around 1138, represents the crucial turning point in this process. Geoffrey created the Arthur who would dominate European literature for the next 8 centuries. A mighty king ruling a vast empire, the greatest knight in Christendom, the creator of a perfect court, where justice and courtesy reigned supreme. Geoffrey's Arthur bore little resemblance to the desperate war leader of post-Roman Britain, but his Historia provided the foundation for all subsequent Arthurian literature. Here was an Arthur who conquered not just the Saxons but all of Europe, who established a court that became the model for medieval chivalry, and who represented the highest ideals of Christian kingship. Geoffrey had transformed a local British hero into a universal symbol of royal perfection. The success of Geoffrey's work was immediate and extraordinary. Within decades, his Historia had been translated into virtually every European language, while poets and chroniclers across the continent began adding their own elaborations to the Arthurian story. The matter of Britain, as it came to be known, became one of the three great cycles of medieval literature, alongside the matter of France, stories of Charlemagne, and the matter of Rome, classical antiquity. French poets were particularly attracted to the Arthurian legend, perhaps because it provided an alternative to the Germanic traditions that dominated early medieval literature. Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the late 12th century, created the Romance tradition that would define Arthurian literature for centuries to come. His poems introduced many of the elements that modern audiences consider essential to the legend: the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, the quest for the Holy Grail, the tragic knight Percival, and the mystical atmosphere that surrounds the entire Arthurian world. These French romances transformed Arthur himself from an active hero into a more passive figure, a wise king whose primary function was to preside over the adventures of his knights rather than to embark on adventures himself. This change reflected the evolution of medieval society from the warrior culture of the early Middle Ages to the more sophisticated court culture of the high medieval period. Arthur became less a war leader and more a symbol of the idealized monarchy that medieval political theorists were beginning to envision. The addition of Christian elements to the Arthurian legend was equally significant. The quest for the Holy Grail, which became central to later versions of the story, transformed the essentially secular heroism of the original Arthur into a spiritual allegory about the search for divine grace. Knights like Galahad and Percival represented the Christian ideal of the warrior monk, while the Grail itself symbolized the perfect fusion of earthly and heavenly authority that medieval Christianity promised to those who proved worthy. This Christianization of the Arthur legend served important political and cultural functions in medieval Europe. At a time when the Church was asserting its authority over secular rulers, the Arthurian romances provided a model of Christian kingship that subordinated political power to spiritual values. Arthur's eventual downfall could be interpreted as the inevitable consequence of moral failure, while the promise of his return suggested that true Christian monarchy would ultimately triumph over the forces of evil and chaos. The popularity of Arthurian literature throughout medieval Europe also reflected deeper cultural anxieties about the nature of political authority and social order. The 12th and 13th centuries were periods of rapid change, when traditional feudal relationships were being challenged by the growth of royal power, urban commerce, and new forms of religious life. The Arthurian romances offered both an escape from these contemporary pressures and a commentary on them, presenting an idealized vision of harmonious social relationships that contrasted sharply with the conflicts and uncertainties of actual medieval life. The Round Table became the perfect symbol of this idealized social order. Unlike the hierarchical arrangements that characterized real medieval courts, the Round Table suggested a community of equals united by shared values, rather than divided by competing interests. The knights who gathered around it represented the best of medieval chivalry, brave, courteous, and devoted to justice, while their fellowship demonstrated the possibility of achieving unity without sacrificing individual excellence. Yet even in its most idealized forms, the Arthurian legend retained traces of the tragic ending that had characterized the historical Arthur's career. The adultery of Guinevere and Lancelot, the quest for the Grail that scattered the Round Table fellowship, and the final battle at Camelot that destroyed Arthur's kingdom. all served as reminders that even the most perfect human institutions were ultimately fragile and temporary. The legend thus combined hope and despair in equal measure, promising both the possibility of achieving perfect justice and the certainty that such achievement could not be permanent. The development of Arthurian literature during the later Middle Ages reflected changing cultural and political circumstances. The prose romances of the 13th century, culminating in the vast Vulgate cycle, created an elaborate fictional history that traced Arthur's story from his miraculous conception to his mysterious disappearance. These works were characterized by increasingly complex narrative structures, psychological sophistication, and theological speculation that reflected the growing intellectual confidence of medieval culture. At the same time, different national traditions began to emphasize different aspects of the Arthurian legend according to their own political and cultural needs. English writers, beginning with Layamon's Brut in the early 13th century, stressed Arthur's role as a British hero who had defended the island against foreign invasion. French authors continued to develop the courtly romance tradition that had made Arthur a symbol of refined civilization. German poets created their own distinctive versions that emphasized the spiritual and mystical dimensions of the Grail quest. The most influential of all medieval Arthurian works was Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, completed around 1470 and printed by William Caxton in 1485. Malory synthesized the entire tradition of Arthurian literature into a single coherent narrative that would shape English-speaking perceptions of the legend for centuries to come. His Arthur was simultaneously the warrior king of early tradition and the courtly monarch of romance, a figure who embodied both the military virtues of the past and the chivalric ideals of his own time. Malory's work appeared at a crucial moment in English history, just as the Wars of the Roses were ending and the Tudor dynasty was establishing its authority. The new royal house claimed descent from Arthur through Welsh genealogies, while Henry VII's decision to name his eldest son Arthur reflected the continued political relevance of the legendary king. The Tudors used Arthurian symbolism to legitimize their rule and to present themselves as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about Arthur's return. This political appropriation of the Arthur legend continued throughout the early modern period, though the specific uses varied according to changing circumstances. Protestant reformers interpreted Arthur as a symbol of English independence from papal authority, while Catholic writers emphasized his role as a defender of Christian civilization. Antiquarians and historians attempted to separate the historical Arthur from the legendary one, though their efforts often served contemporary political agendas as much as scholarly objectives. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries brought a new wave of interest in Arthurian literature, though the emphasis shifted from political utility to aesthetic and emotional appeal. Writers like Sir Walter Scott and Alfred Tennyson created versions of the Arthur story that emphasized its medieval atmosphere and tragic beauty rather than its contemporary relevance. Tennyson's Idylls of the King, in particular, presented Arthur as a figure of Victorian moral earnestness, whose kingdom failed because it could not maintain the high ethical standards that had created it. This Victorian Arthur reflected the concerns and values of an imperial age that saw itself as the heir to medieval chivalry. The Round Table became a metaphor for gentlemanly conduct and imperial responsibility, while Arthur himself embodied the ideal of the Christian ruler who governed through moral authority rather than mere force. The tragic ending of the legend served as a warning about the fragility of civilization and the constant need for moral vigilance to preserve it. The 20th century brought yet another transformation of the Arthur legend, as writers and artists responded to the unprecedented upheavals of modern warfare, social revolution, and cultural change. T.H. White's The Once and Future King reimagined Arthur as a figure struggling with the moral complexities of political power, while archaeological discoveries provided new evidence about the historical period in which Arthur may have lived. Modern Arthurian literature has generally emphasized the humanity rather than the perfection of Arthur and his knights, presenting them as flawed individuals struggling with moral dilemmas that have no easy solutions. This approach reflects both the psychological sophistication of a modern literature and the skepticism about authority that characterizes contemporary culture. The Arthur of modern fiction is often a reluctant hero who understands the costs of leadership and the inevitability of failure. Yet the essential appeal of the Arthur legend has remained constant throughout its long evolution. In every age, the story has provided a means of exploring fundamental questions about leadership, justice, loyalty, and the relationship between individual virtue and social order. Whether presented as historical fact, religious allegory, political propaganda, or psychological drama, the Arthur story continues to offer both inspiration and warning about the possibilities and limitations of human achievement. The archaeological evidence that has emerged over the past century has added new dimensions to our understanding of the historical period in which Arthur may have lived, but it has not resolved the fundamental question of his existence. Sites like Cadbury Castle and Tintagel have yielded evidence of significant activity during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, suggesting that powerful leaders did emerge among the post-Roman British. But none of this evidence can be definitively linked to a historical Arthur, and the gap between the archaeological record and the legendary tradition remains unbridgeable. Perhaps this uncertainty is ultimately appropriate for a figure who has always existed as much in imagination as in history. The power of the Arthur legend has never depended on its historical accuracy, but on its ability to embody human aspirations and to provide a vocabulary for discussing the eternal problems of political and moral life. Whether Arthur actually existed matters less than the fact that people have found his story meaningful for over 15 centuries. The promise of Arthur's return, which has been central to the legend since its earliest recorded versions, reflects a deep human need to believe that justice will ultimately triumph over injustice, that good leaders will emerge in times of crisis, and that the values we cherish will survive even the most catastrophic defeats. In every generation, people have identified their own struggles with Arthur's struggle and have found hope in the promise that the once and future king will return when he is most needed. This hope has taken many forms over the centuries: political, religious, literary, and personal. Sometimes it has inspired resistance to tyranny, sometimes the creation of new institutions, sometimes simply the preservation of cultural memories that might otherwise have been lost. In each case, the Arthur legend has provided both a standard of excellence to aspire to and a reminder that even the greatest human achievements are temporary and fragile. As you settle into the deepest phases of sleep, imagine the countless storytellers who have kept Arthur's memory alive through the centuries. Celtic bards singing in smoky halls, medieval poets reciting in castle courtyards, Victorian authors writing by gaslight, modern screenwriters crafting tales for global audiences. Each has added something to the legend while preserving its essential core. The story of a leader who tried to create something better than what came before, and who, despite ultimate failure, left behind a memory that would inspire others to attempt the same impossible dream. The historical Arthur, if he existed, probably died believing that his life's work had failed completely. His kingdom was destroyed, his followers were scattered, and his enemies seemed triumphant. Yet in another sense, he achieved the greatest victory possible for any human being. He became immortal, not in body, but in memory, not in fact, but in meaning, not in history, but in hope. The real Camelot was indeed built of mud and timber, and it crumbled into dust within a generation of its creation. But the imaginary Camelot that storytellers built from that memory has endured for 15 centuries and shows no sign of fading. In the end, perhaps, The dream was more important than the reality, the legend more powerful than the history, the hope more enduring than the achievement. For in our dreams, Arthur's kingdom never fell. In our imagination, the Round Table still gathers. In our hearts, the once and future king still reigns, waiting for the moment when the world will need him again. And perhaps, in some sense, that transcends the boundaries between fact and fiction. He always will.